Hello, everybody. Uh, well, man, it's more Pick'ems. This is gonna be a bit weirder of an episode, so just so you're aware, I'm back alone. Unfortunately, Brett is not with me again today. However, this is my second time recording this, and if you're familiar with how Pick'ems works, is my bracket. You can only save your predictions once, and I didn't save them. That's perfect. The fates aligned. So, alright. No, it's not going to be weird at all. So, quickly getting into this. Last week, we saw the lineup for Summer Showdown we made. First, I'm going to talk about my crystal ball picks. I only got 50% this time. Shock and Seoul are the only two that are here. And I think I'm only going to be getting one of these two in the end. That being the San Francisco Shock. Not actually. Spoiler alert. The Shock are not winning this tournament. I actually think maybe Seoul. So. But quickly going into recapping week 4. The Chengdu Hunters lost their position in the tournament to the Guangzhou Charge after they got 3-0'd by them on Friday. And they also lost to the Valiant on Saturday. A bit of a disappointing matchup from both these days for the Chengdu Hunters. But man, for the Valiant, this looked really good. The Valiant looked amazing in this match. It was really close, but it just kind of shows how great players like Dia are, especially Dia on Junker Queen. Like, probably one of the better Junker Queens in APAC. It's just unfortunate that a lot of the other members of the LA Valiant just aren't as good as Dia. On that, I mean, we had the Dragons playing the best that they've ever played. And Seoul, unfortunately, kind of falling apart. Saturday, they went map 5 to the Fusion. And on Sunday, they lost 3-0 to the Dragons. This is not what we expect from the Dynasty. And kind of puts a little bit of doubt in their performance coming into the Summer Showdown. But I mean, Guangzhou is also another one that we got to talk about. I mean, Guangzhou did phenomenally, 3-0ing the Hunters and losing only a map to the Spark. I mean, as much as I expected them to beat the Spark, I think going into it, I honestly kind of expected them just kind of win in the end. Because I think that the Spark is just a really good team. Even if they aren't performing that great this tournament, I feel like they have had their bright moments. And I feel like Charge would have been an easy one to beat. But so here we are, week 4 with the West region. Gladiators had a great performance against the Atlanta Reign. Like I said last week when I was doing predictions, this is what the Gladiators needed to do. They needed to put space on Junker Queen, and they finally did it, and it worked out so well for them. Unfortunately, in the end, London smashed all of their hopes and dreams of going to Toronto by beating Toronto on Toronto to get to Toronto so they can beat Toronto again on Toronto in Toronto and Toronto. Yeah. So, Gladiators had that moment, and they unfortunately failed. My pick'ems actually had the Gladiators making it to the tournament over the London Spitfire. But honestly, myself, I'm glad that didn't happen, because the Gladiators don't need a three-peat in mid-season tournaments. Nixel in Paris had a decent showing here. I mean, Nixel's not that great, but Paris hasn't been picking up many maps lately, even against the New York Excelsior. And it was nice to see that Paris was able to pick up a map here against them this time. And I was right about the downfall of the Shock. The Shock lost 3-1 to the Dallas Fuel. This was a phenomenal match to see. I'm really glad I decided to watch it. And I mean, past Friday, I watched every match, pretty much, if I was awake for it. Which, for the most part, I was, because I slept worth garbage this past weekend while being sick. As I mentioned in my last episode, in the last Pick'ems. But back here again. Still feeling a little under the weather, but I'm feeling a bit better. Especially since it's only Tuesday. Or technically it's Wednesday. Not technically, it is. Because I'm recording this at 3 a.m. almost. I recorded this many hours ago. But, yeah, I had a bit of a mess up with OBS. So, I'm back recording it. Thankfully, I didn't even say my predictions, so this is just easy. Basically, got to re-record everything I said hours ago. But Dallas played perfectly. I think that was a phenomenal performance by them. Giving them the first seed and tremendous amounts of momentum going into this tournament. Another team that I feel like has a lot of momentum going into this is the Houston Outlaws. They were able to beat the Washington Justice 3-0, and that was what the Outlaws needed. This is what secured them that third seed. Pretty much, Toronto guaranteed it again by losing to the Spitfire, but Outlaws got that third seed and really kind of puts them up on a pedestal where people are expecting pretty big things from them. And I think that this is a tournament that they have where they could go pretty far. A team that isn't going to go very far is Washington Justice. I mean, you know, we've looking back at week 3 real quick, you know, they lost map 5 to the Titans. I mean, sure, they beat the Spitfire map 5 as well, but to me that really isn't worth much, at least compared to the loss against the Titans, especially when you compare Houston's match against the Titans where they won 3-0. You know, that just kind of shows the skill gap between these two teams. I mean, Justice, you know, going into how this new team looked, you know, people had high hopes for them after they beat the Mayhem 3-1, but I mean, really, Mayhem haven't been that great either. So, I mean, sure, I mean, looking right here, you know, they have 2 3-0 victories, but they're against the 2 bottom teams in the league right now, that being the Paris Eternal and the New York Excelsior. Like, you really can't say that they're doing that great. So, I mean, personally myself, I kind of saw through it. I don't think the Justice are that great of a team, at least anymore. I think before they made all these budget cuts, I think they were looking pretty good. But not anymore. A team that was looking pretty bad, but is now looking a lot better, is Boston. Something going into this past week was Boston getting rid of their head coach Laurie, finally, because now Punk is back in the lineup, and that is what gave Boston the upper hand in this match against the Titans. History dictates that if the Titans lose a map, they lose the game, and Titans went up 0-2 and went up 2-0 in the match, and then they lost on Hybrid or Escort, whatever map 3 was. I'm blanking on it right now, but and that just went downhill for them. They got reverse swept, which is unfortunate because Vancouver may have even made it to the 4th seed had the Justice beat the Outlaws and Spitfire beat the Defiant. I think Vancouver would have clinched out 4th seed, maybe even 3rd seed. But here they became the 6th seed, which is still baffling in my opinion. Speaking of baffling, London beats Toronto on Toronto to get to Toronto so they can beat Toronto in Toronto on Toronto. Toronto. That's really all there is to say. This was a really close match, super fun to see, and really Chadi said it best, which I'm not saying again because I'm sick of saying Toronto. Nixle, Florida was a pretty cut and dry match. Nothing really spectacular to say about it. Now going into the Summer Showdown, to start the weekend off, Thursday we have the Justice versus the Fuel. I don't see Justice picking up a map here against the Fuel. Kalios and them and crew just not that great. That and Sparkle doesn't want to see Decay happy, so them winning a map would make Decay happy, and Sparkle doesn't want that to happen. Next up, we have the London Spitfire taking on Toronto in Toronto, possibly even on Toronto. But while the Spitfire beat Toronto on Sunday, I don't think this is happening again on Thursday. I think that with the home field advantage on LAN, Toronto has the upper hand here. And I'm going to give it to the Defiant in a map 5 finish. Next up, we have the Vancouver Titans and the San Francisco Shock. Now, Titans aren't winning this. I will preface that before I go on with what I'm going to say here. You know, this past Friday proved something with the Shock. And really, it should have been picked up on sooner. And that is, the Shock are not good in this meta. I know. Blasphemous. The Shock not good. But hear me out here. I want to go and look at each week that they had here. Friday, August 12th. The Shock versus the Justice. The Justice are at their peak right now. This is the good Justice. And they went map 5 against them. You know, Justice, not that great after this. But, you know, they were looking pretty good here. Could that just be that the Justice here were looking really great, and we gotta give a lot of praise to, you know, Mag and Happy and them? Or could it just be the Shock's easy schedule and a bit of an overhypeness to Mag? Because we look at Mag after when he gets to the Boston Uprising, and he was doing really terribly. One of the lower middle tier Junker Queen players. And you kind of got to think, could that have just been the fact that the Shock weren't great in this meta? Beating Florida 3-0, I mean, Florida was kind of struggling in this meta. I'm sure they beat Spitfire, who were also struggling. Again, easy schedule for the Shock. The Shock go against the Uprising. Uprising, not that great here. Get 3-0'd. Go against the Gladiators, who are not that good in this meta. They beat them. Gladiators aren't in this tournament. Boston is in this tournament. Justice is at the bottom of the barrel here. Mayhem is also towards the bottom of the barrel here. That's 4 teams that are either not in this tournament or are at the bottom 4 of this tournament. In fact, Florida and Justice are number 7 and number 8 seeds. Week 3, Nixle. One of the worst teams in this tournament right now. Dallas lose 3-1. The Shock are not good in this meta. It's a pattern that really needs to be pointed out here, and I don't think anyone's really noticing that. Shock had probably the easiest schedule going into this tournament. Their only 2 blemishes were the Fuel and the Gladiators, which Gladiators proved week 1 they're not good in this meta with Reiner. and they were playing Reiner during that match. They weren't playing Space. And, Space clearly a better Junker Queen, but in this meta, at the start of the meta, they were playing Reiner, who wasn't good. And that just kind of proves my point. The Shock is not good in this meta. They had the easiest schedule out of any other team, and that's why they're at 2nd seed. I think if they were facing teams like the Outlaws, like the Defiant, even like the Spitfire later in the meta, Shock probably wouldn't have had that great of a record. They might have even dropped a game to some of these teams and dropped a lot more maps, and maybe even went into the 3rd seed. That being said, I think Shock are going to beat the Titans, but I think it's going to be map 5. I don't think that the Titans have what it takes to beat the Shock. As much as I love the Titans, and as much as I love the wholesome exchange D-Pay and Sam had, the Shock have this in the bag. And I think it's going to be similar to that of this Shanghai Seal match. It was a close game, but Shock kind of had the upper hand in the majority of it. But I think Titans are going to be able to take quite a good fight to the Shock. Next up, we have Florida and Houston. I think Houston's winning this 3-0. Florida might take map. I think I'll give them a map. But other than that, I think that's pretty much it for my discussion of it. I mean, someone is a decent Junker Queen. Not phenomenal. They have Checkmate versus Pelican. Pelican is such a better Genji than Checkmate. Merit and Hydran are phenomenal Sojourns, but I think when it comes down to it, Merit is leagues better than Hydran. And then now, in the winners round 2, we have the Dallas Fuel against the Toronto Defiant. Clearly, I'm giving this to the Fuel, but out of posterity, I want to give Toronto a map. So, I think both of these teams have potential to have a close game. But clearly Dallas is going to be winning this. Honestly, the point that Toronto has right now is just a pity point. I don't think they have what it takes to take a map against the Dallas Fuel, but I think it's going to be very close regardless. Next up is the Shock versus the Outlaws. Now, this is where my discussion about the Shock comes into play. What has Houston been doing this entire tournament? The teams that have had, pretty much all the teams that Shock have been beating, Houston has been beating better. Or at least these teams that are a bit better that we would expect, Shock to sweep. They've been doing it better than, they've been doing phenomenal here. I mean, they had a close game against the Gladiators, sure. But Gladiator, they were facing, the kind of the same team. And even in here, Houston was playing. This was their first game with Dante on Junker Queen, so he was still learning the character, not performing the best. The Nixel game, sure, they lost to Nixel, but they were playing they were playing Doge on Junker Queen, who just wasn't clicking with the team at all. So there's an excuse there. There's a reason why they lost. They had 2 new teammates that just didn't synergize well at this point. Doge just wasn't a great Junker Queen. Week 2, sure, they get swept by London, but this is a brand new London that are coming back from a pretty poor week 1. And then coming into week 3, they beat the Rain, who were on the up. They 3-1 the Spitfire, and then they lost map 5 to the Rain. to the Outlaws. Vancouver, who had barrels upon barrels of momentum hurtling at the Outlaws, they beat the Titans 3-0. Going into week 4, Shock went mat 5 against the Justice. Outlaws 3-0 them. Like, Houston has a lot of momentum going into this. They've had tremendous victories. Even though they've had a couple blemishes, they're still looking great. They're 3rd seed, just below the Shock, at a 4-2 record. I will give Shock a point because I do think that this is going to be a very close game. However, I think Houston has what it takes to beat the Shock. And, I mean, I also want to bring up, look at opening weekend 2021. Nobody bets against the Shock but Danny Lim. And what does the Houston Outlaws do? They beat the San Francisco Shock. And here is where they do it again. Now, going on to the elimination round 1, London's 3-0ing the Justice. I mean, sure, they won 3-2 this time, but I think that London can easily beat this Justice team. Again, I'll give Justice a point. No, I'll give them a mat 5. But I don't think... I'll give Toronto a 3-0. Well, I'll give Dallas a 3-0, I should say. Justice, mat 5. Titans and Mayhem. I'm going to give Titans a 3-0 against the Mayhem. I think that the Mayhem just aren't as great. Aspire versus Hydran. Aspire is probably the number 2 Sojourn in my opinion. Just below Merit. And then Hydran is number 3. And I think that those are going to be the 2 keys here. Mirror and Someone. Mirror is such a better Junker Queen over Someone. And that's going to be what tilts this in the favor of the Titans so strongly. Next up, we have the winners round 3. That is the Dallas Fuel versus the Houston Outlaws. Battle for Texas in Toronto. I'm giving this to the Fuel, but I think this is going to be a fairly close game. Probably not mat 5, probably mat 4. I think both these teams synergize very well regardless of the meta. And, I mean, Houston's got that land buff against Dallas. So it really could come down to Houston beating the Fuel here. Especially when it's like an in-person event. Houston builds off the energy of the crowd much better than Dallas. And I think that's what might give Houston a bit of an advantage against the Fuel. But I think overall, Dallas is winning this match. Next up, in the rest of eliminations, we have the Spitfire versus the Shock. I'm going to give this a mat 5 victory to the Shock. Maybe a reverse sweep. But Spitfire and Shock both have similar styles. And I think that, which is when it comes down to it, the Shock are going to have a pretty... I'll give them a 3-1. I think this is going to be a close game. I think London's going to have a great fight here. But I think overall, the Shock are going to take this one. Next up, we have the Battle for Canada, Vancouver versus Toronto. As much as I want to give this to Defiant, I think I'm going to give this to the Titans in a very close match. I think just Hisu versus Aspire going to be a really fun match to see. Same thing with, just the rest of this team. Like, I think that Toronto has a phenomenal lineup and is going to have a great match against the Vancouver Titans. But I think when it comes down to it, Mirror, Aspire, and King absolutely amazing trio of players that could just get the damage done against the Defiant and be able to take them out. Next up, we have the Shock versus the Titans. The Titans, the last member of Canada standing, going against the Titan of the Overwatch League that isn't the Titans, that being the Shock. And again, as I mentioned, the Shock not looking great in this meta. And Shock is on their tirade of losers that we see every year, or every time that they lose a match in a tournament. However, I think Vancouver will, with the power of Canada on their side, chugging their maple syrup, they're going to beat the San Francisco Shock. This new Shock kind of seems to struggle when they lose a match in a tournament. They seem to kind of lose themselves mentally rather more than physically. They just kind of mentally drain, lose their confidence, and this is where they fall apart. And I think that that's where it's going to happen. I'll give it a map 5 to the Spitfire, but I think regardless, the Shock are beating them. And I think this is where they fall, is to the Titans. Lastly, in the losers, we have the Titans and the Outlaws. This is the farthest either team has made it in a tournament. For Houston, ever. And for Titans, in a very, very long time. Probably a difficult one for me to predict. But I gotta give it to the Outlaws, I should say. Mentioning back to the previous week, Titans lost 3-0 to the Outlaws. And honestly, I think that could happen again. Lastly, we have the Dallas Fuel and the Houston Outlaws going at it. Battle for Texas one more time in the finals. I gotta give this to Dallas again. I'm not gonna give it a map 7. I think it's gonna go 6. It's going to be a very close game, but I think overall the Dallas Fuel are going to be beating the Houston Outlaws to claim the Summer Showdown crown. Next up, we're going on to the vastly shorter East region, where we see the Guangzhou Charge taking on the Shanghai Dragons. 3-0 for the Dragons. This new Charge looks great. They have a lot of momentum going into this. However, this is the Dragons. They just 3-0 the Seal Dynasty for, that's a huge win. And I think they're going to carry that momentum into this match. Next up is the Fusion versus the Dynasty. Now, Fusion and Dynasty are notorious for their tournament performances. Fusion is notorious for being 50-50, either doing really well or doing really poorly. The Dynasty, on the other hand, is notorious for being really good in tournaments, but kind of choking towards the end. It's basically Fusion when they want to try in a tournament. That being said, even though Seoul is having a really down part, I think they're actually going to lose 3-0 to the Fusion. Initially, I was thinking Seoul would win this, but I'm actually going to give it to the Fusion because I want to be a little spicy. That being said, in losers round 1, Seoul is going to beat the Charge, but I think it's going to be pretty close. In fact, I think Seoul might take a map from Fusion. Man, East Region literally only has one game on Saturday. Weird. I guess when you have 5 games, one of them are going to be, well, you have 6. You could have split them 2-2-2. Done, winners round 1 on Friday. Winners 2 and elimination 1 on Saturday, and then elimination 2 and finals on Sunday. But whatever, I guess. That brings us to winners round 2. The Dragons versus the Fusion. I'm actually going to give it to the Fusion. Because again, like I said, Fusion either does really well or they do really poorly. And while Dragons look phenomenal, this year they've been a bit wonky on their tournament performances. And I think that might play into them possibly losing this match. Which brings us to Seoul and Shanghai in the finals. Seoul's going to lose. Like, I'm not even going to give them a map. Speaking of not giving map, Fusion's going to lose 4-0 to the Dragons in the finals because it's the Fusion. And that is all that I have to say for Summer Showdown. I think it's going to be probably one of the most exciting tournaments. I mean, look at, like, there's so much upset potential here. Like, really, anybody could beat anybody. It just kind of depends on how people feel like performing in the week. Like, you know, we could see London beat Toronto. We could see the Shock lose to the Titans. We could even see the Outlaws lose to the Mayhem. Like, most of these games are anybody's to win. But, you know, I feel really confident about this. And particularly about the Shock losing to the Outlaws. I feel like my reasoning is pretty solid. Shock had such an easy schedule going into this tournament up until their matchup against the Fuel. And I think that just kind of proves just how poor the Shock are performing right now. They lost plenty of maps to teams that they probably shouldn't have, i.e. the Justice. But I think overall, this is going to be a very exciting tournament. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm looking forward to seeing your reactions in the comments below. What do you think about this tournament? Do you think it's going to be as hectic as I'm predicting it? Again, comment down below. And that is all. I will see you guys in 2 weeks for the start of the Countdown Cup. Like, it's weird to think we are just 2 months away from the playoffs. And that's just, it's really baffling to think about. But here's to a great midway tournament. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks for the Countdown Cup week 1. And I'll see you guys then. Have a wonderful day.